Let's see.
Yep, one more over.
Oh, you sit on
They
the
got me
end.
at the end.
There you go.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Does that sound all right? Hi, everyone. A nice full room. Thank you. Welcome to the Institute of Politics here at St. Anselm. I am Scott Spradling. I'll be your moderator this morning for what I think will be a really interesting and robust conversation about the Supreme Court. We're going to spend most of our time talking about the United States Supreme Court, where we're at, maybe where we're going, some insight about what we should be talking about, perhaps some signs that we may have missed. We've got three wonderful speakers who all have a great experience in this conversation, but also, I think, some really sage observations about where we are at right now with our Supreme Court. What we'll do is I'll ask some questions of our panel for a little while. Then we will essentially turn it over for some questions from all of you before we break up for the rest of the morning. And again, it's great to see all of you here. Let me get right to the introductions. I'll start from my far left, your far right. Governor Howard Dean. He's a former DNC chair, presidential candidate, six-term governor of the state of Vermont, and a physician. Governor Dean began his career in public service back in 1982 when he transitioned from a full-time practicing physician to an elected representative in Vermont. He served as governor for 12 years, the second longest-serving governor in the history of that state. He was chair of the National Governors Association, the Democratic Governors Association, and the New England Governors Conference while he served as governor of Vermont. He left office to run for president in 2003. During that campaign, he implemented innovative fundraising strategies and digital organizing tactics. I'm going to get to that in a second when we chat. As chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Governor Dean created and implemented the 50-state strategy and is credited with helping Democrats make historic gains in 2006 and 2008. Governor, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Maggie Goodlander is currently an adjunct professor at UNH Law School. She's a former clerk to both Merrick Garland on the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia and for Justice Stephen Breyer of the Supreme Court. She is a Yale Law School graduate, which I'm told is a pretty decent law school, and currently resides in the city of Portsmouth. She previously worked in the U.S. Senate for both Joe Lieberman and the late John McCain as a senior advisor. Maggie, welcome. Thank you for being here. And finally, former Congresswoman Carol Shea-Porter. She served 4 terms in the U.S. House representing New Hampshire's 1st District. She retired in 2019 and was succeeded by Chris Pappas. Upon her election in 2006, she became the first woman elected to federal office from the state of New Hampshire. During her final term in Congress, she served on the Committee on Education and Labor and the Committee on Armed Services and was also a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Congresswoman Shea-Porter, thank you for joining us. So we'll jump right in, and I want to give Governor Dean a chance to reach into his phone and maybe give us some instant updates which might set the tone for perhaps the urgency of this conversation, which has been arguably lacking and maybe one of the reasons why we're all in this room having this conversation about the Supreme Court. But before I have you read, Governor Dean, I have to say a moment of personal privilege. So back in 2003, I used to work with WMUR-TV. I was their political reporter. So when he left office and began his campaign for president, one of the very first times I covered Governor Dean, he was at the Fire Academy in Concord on a tour. And the gentleman who really set it on fire in the 03-04 presidential primary campaign and really revolutionized using technology to connect to people and to connect with fundraising, he really is more than any kind of a 2004 primary footnote. He changed the way campaigns did their jobs, and it was in a very impressive way. But what I remember most was the governor showing up with his one trooper detail and nobody else. And it was me and my videographer, the governor and his detail, and 3 guys from the Fire Academy, and I had a blast. We had a lot of fun. And what I can say about Howard Dean, the man, is that he's the same guy sitting right there in that chair as I remember covering 17 years ago when he was running for president. And this process can change people, hasn't changed this guy. So, Governor, welcome, and let me jump in and just... Why don't you bring us up to speed on some conversations happening about possible things happening at the Supreme Court?
I'm going to do this, but there's going to be a 2-second Vermont history lesson. Vermont was an independent republic. Part of it was claimed by New Hampshire from 1777 to 1791. And the first governor of Vermont was Thomas Chittenden. He's the only governor that served longer than I have. However, he served 7 of his terms when Vermont was an independent republic. There were 1-year terms in those days, and 8 or 9 terms as a state. So I am the longest serving governor in the history of the state of Vermont.
There we go.
So he is the longest.
Let the record be corrected.
Right.
So as governors, you're looking up these quotes.
No, I've got them right here.
There's a lot, obviously there's a lot of conversation going on right now about the sort of the, if you're a Patriots person, you know, next man up, right? Who's in line? So who is the next person up in the Trump administration who could fill any possible new vacancies that might come up? And Governor, what are you seeing and what are you reading?
Antonio Brown would be better than any of them. So here's I'm here to talk about the corruption of the Supreme Court, and it has become corrupted, not because individuals are taking checks, although actually Justice Thomas's wife does speak in front of groups that then have interest before the Supreme Court. The whole process has been corrupted. And this is a very dangerous thing for the country, and the real purpose of having this discussion is not that we're going to come up with all the solutions. I would like the presidential candidates running for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States to start talking about what we plan to do to fix this. We cannot continue to allow this. I want you to read some quotes from a story this morning about a far-right candidate for the appellate court. This guy's 40 years old. He has, they kept him off the roster and put him on last night. His hearing will be today. His name is Menashe. His past writings include comparing race data collection in college admissions to Germany under Adolf Hitler, denouncing women's marches as sexual assault, and defending a Dartmouth fraternity who held a ghetto party attended by white partygoers wearing afros and saying it wasn't racist. This guy is going to be rammed through by Mitch McConnell. That is corrupt. It is corrupt for the Federalist Society to take large anonymous donations for the purposes of influencing who's on the Supreme Court, the founder of which just did a fundraiser in Maine for Susan Collins as a reward for her voting for Brett Kavanaugh. There are two justices in the Supreme Court which I consider not to be legitimately there. One is Gorsuch, who just wrote a book, incidentally, saying something about we have a crisis of civility. Without the crisis of civility, Judge Gorsuch wouldn't have been on the bench because Mitch McConnell put him on there by disrupting the civility in the Senate. And of course, Kavanaugh, who never had an FBI investigation until the last day, which obviously is not enough time for an FBI investigation. The problem here, I argue, is not that they're all right-wingers. The problem is they're unqualified to serve, they're incompetent, and the biggest problem of all is that the public in this country does not believe the judicial system serves them anymore. And it's particularly bad among young people. Our children, 18 to 34, believe, 71% of them believe that the court will make political decisions before they consider what the proper legal decision is. Our court system is broken. It's broken by corruption. It's broken by lack of civility. It's broken by people who don't value American democracy. I want to hear what the Democratic presidential candidates have to say about what they're going to do to fix this court system, because business as usual is not going to fix it.
Governor, as a follow-up, let me ask you this question. In 2016, President Trump won voters who said to them that the Supreme Court was their #1 issue, and he beat Hillary Clinton by 15 points in that category. Given what you've just uncovered and about this particular nominee, given what we've seen with 2 Supreme Court justices appointed by President Trump, do you think this is now the year the Supreme Court becomes that much more relevant to the Democratic voters and to independents who might be concerned about this? Is this the year?
It should be. The issue is not so much what their politics is. That's what the right wing cares about, that the potential, the people who vote saying they cared most about the Supreme Court. They are hard-line right-wing authoritarians. The biggest problem, however, is that the average person doesn't care about the Supreme Court. Now they're beginning to understand how much corruption there is in the system, in the selection system is the corruption. This is really not so much of an issue of right or left, although Carol's going to talk some about this. It's more of an issue of the corruption and the unreliability of the system. What makes us different than most other countries, particularly the authoritarian countries, is we live in the rule of law. Without the rule of law, we don't prosper. Other countries, they fall down economically because people won't invest in them because they don't believe they can get a fair shake in the court system. And I work in a lot of these countries in places like, even our allies, Albania and places like that have corrupt court system. Our system is headed in that direction. When you can buy a seat on the Supreme Court by donating huge amounts of money to the Federalist Society without anybody knowing who gave that money, that is corruption. We have a crisis of corruption in the court system today. It has to be fixed, and it has to be addressed by the Democratic nominee. And whether the voters believe that or not, young people absolutely believe it by 71%. We should do something about this, and we're going to have to do something about this.
Thank you, Governor. Congresswoman Shea-Porter, I want to jump in, and I want to get your answer to that as well about whether or not this is now the year that Democrats and independent voters are really looking at the Supreme Court as a litmus test type issue that will drive people and have a higher level of concern. But I also want to point out that this month is the one-year anniversary of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, and you were in Washington at the time. I'm curious to hear what your observations were about that time frame and what legacy that process may be leaving on all of us as we move forward to continue our selection process of Supreme Court justices.
All right, well, let's talk about Justice Kavanaugh to begin
Sure.
with, because I was there, and I stood on the steps of the Supreme Court with all of the other protesters and listened to the stories of these women across the country from every state, and it was so painful. I mean, I just sobbed, and so did everybody else listening to this. And then afterwards, they all moved into the office building there, and we stayed there until the police kindly told us we'd be arrested if we didn't move, and I didn't want to be arrested. So I went up to the 4th floor and watched, and the police were very respectful, but the heavy atmosphere of sadness, of just desperation, and women crying because obviously they had been victims and they knew, what was about to happen there. So, and it left such a bitter aftertaste, as we're talking about, for everybody, because the way that Justice Kavanaugh had behaved when he was being asked questions by female senators, I thought was pretty indicative of his general attitude and how the direction he would go in. But it wasn't just that. We knew, because there was an email that was in the Bush administration, that he wondered if Roe had to stay law, if it was a permanent thing there. So we knew that we were about to receive a justice who could swing the court and be that other voice there. And sure enough, there's no reason to think any differently about him. I would say that it isn't even just his positions. It's also a question of attitude. When you have a justice, you want them listening. You want to believe that they're open, that they're going to be fair if you go before. Americans need to believe that if they go to court, it will be fair. And every indicator from McConnell, from the Senate Majority Leader all the way down, was it's not going to be fair. It's going to be their agenda. It's going to be rammed through. We know that McConnell's already changed 2 rules so that it's easier to get his agenda through.
So let me ask you a loaded question, and I'm throwing this softball at you because you kind of said it just before we came out here this morning. What does it say about our voting public witnessing all of these developments, from the hearings to the quotes that the governor just pulled out, to the levels of concern about the lasting impact of Supreme Court rulings on major issues like Roe v. Wade and others? What would it mean if Donald Trump is reelected for 4 more years?
Well, let's back up for a minute and say, what did it mean in 2018?
Okay.
And then we'll talk about that. In 2018, women and men, Republicans, Democrats, and independents showed up at the polls. And I think it was a loud, resounding message. And we also saw the Women's March and all the other things that have happened. It was a loud, resounding message that Americans intended to really, follow these issues and to be responsive at the polls.
Okay.
So we saw, some pretty impressive seats flipping in 2018. But still, we know that President Trump gets all his recommendations. He didn't just find these names. Donald Trump doesn't have any idea who is what and who does what in this country. They're given to him. They are all pre-vetted, which is the thing that should stick in all of our minds, that he gets a list of pre-vetted candidates from the Federalist Society that we heard Governor Dean talking about, which has a ton of money and is using that money to influence. That is the problem. Now, what does it mean for this election? It means that people need to pay attention. They have to talk to each other. When you leave here, I hope that you will go and look up all of these groups that we're talking about. I'm sure you've heard of them, but they have a day-to-day record that they keep building upon, which I think is very detrimental to our sense of trust and our sense that we have a democracy here and that we have fair and open courts. So the fact that Donald Trump has already committed himself to choosing all of the anti-choice candidates, the fact that these people are already vetted, which would be an outrage if it had been done by Democrats or by independents, but for some reason this is acceptable to McConnell. It's vetted, so there isn't going to be anyone who slips through that might be neutral, who might have an open mind. This is the reason that we're all here. This is the reason that we need to talk about. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, this is wrong for people to be looking at the courts and seeing what they're doing. And, you know, they have said that they would like to see it as kind of a litmus test for every single candidate who comes through. That is really against what I believe is our fundamental beliefs about our justice system.
Maggie, let me bring you into the conversation, and I obviously want to get your opinion, but first and foremost, can you paint a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of what your experience was like as a clerk down there? Because you've seen the Supreme Court from a very different perspective than the rest of us. Can you share with us a little bit about what that experience was like?
Yeah, you know, I think that this statistic is really shocking, that 70% of young people in this country really are of the view that the court is totally political. And I think that, you know, I'll talk a bit about why, you know, that it would be easy to come to that conclusion. I think my own experience, you know, working for the two judges in this country who I think are the best judges in this country, Chief Judge Merrick Garland and Justice Breyer, for me, reaffirmed faith in how judging should really work. I mean, these are two judges who do exactly what you would want a judge to do, which is they keep an open mind. You know, they read the text of the statute, but they're open to looking at sources beyond the text. And you know, at the end of the day, they're both just deeply reasonable people. And so, for me, it was an extraordinary learning experience.
So, based on what the governor said, what the congresswoman said, in terms of the levels of concern and the amount of focus that we're now starting to see on the Supreme Court, you are now in a classroom with young, soon-to-be attorneys. You are around young minds. What is your sense of concern, and what are you maybe hearing from the grassroots of the legal community, if you will, about the changing nature of the Supreme Court?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, it all begins, of course, with the nomination process, and it's utterly broken. You know, Senator McConnell's decision in 2016 to really, there's no other way to put it than to say what it is. He stole a seat on the court, and he stole a pivotal seat on the court. So that sort of sets, I think it brought this problem to a new fever pitch. And I think looking ahead to vacancies that may emerge, you know, for Senator McConnell to turn around last week and once again reaffirm that if there were a vacancy in an election year, he would be happy to fill the seat. I mean, I think this just shows without any shadow of a doubt that this process, the nomination process, is itself broken. And so that's one huge piece of the problem. I think another piece of the problem, and maybe what would help to explain why it is that young people in particular have lost faith in the court, is that, you know, for most of its history, the Supreme Court has been actually quite a nonpartisan body. You know, I saw recently a study that looked at every sort of highly contested Supreme Court decision from 1790 until 2010, or no, sorry, until the early 2000s, because that's when things, I think, began to really shift. And it basically shows that in highly contested cases where there were more than 2 dissents, really only a small handful of those cases were decided squarely on party lines. And I think that part of the reason for that is that it's only really now, since 2010, for the first time in American history, that the court has been made up of justices who, you know, whose views reflect the party of the president who nominated them. That hasn't been a trend throughout American history. You know, take Roe v. Wade, for example. Roe v. Wade was a 7-2 decision in which 5 Republicans were in the majority, together with 2 Democrats. And the 2 dissenting justices were from both parties. So this was a decision where this was a decision that, didn't reflect the party of the president who nominated the justices, Justice Blackmun, being one of the examples of justices who departed from their party's lines. Now we have squarely a 5-4 court that matches up along party lines. And if you look at the decisions from the last 2 years, the year before last was a whole slew of 5-4 decisions that fell squarely on party lines on the most important issues, I think some of the most important issues facing the country, from the travel ban to a case about healthcare clinics and the right to inform women, the right to an abortion, to major antitrust cases, some of the more technical cases. So these were 5-4 decisions. The court took, I think, more care this year than they have maybe ever in the court's history to try to possibly be conscious of this problem. And I think it shows that, everyone, including the justices themselves, have a recognition that this is a massive problem that has got to be addressed.
What does the fix to the process that you talked about with the nomination process, what does that fix look like? How do we fix this? This is really for any of the three of you. How do we at least restore faith in the nomination and process moving forward, in the confirmation process? What do we do?
Well, I have a few suggestions. We think we know what we do. Again,
okay.
There's been lots of different kinds of ideas. We need more justices on the court, and we have to have term limits and all these kinds of things, some of which have constitutional issues. You have to change the Constitution. One of the things that is, the thing that's the most broken, and I was joking around about Vermont earlier, but we have a great system in my state. And this is the kind of system we should figure out how to do federally. When there's a vacancy on the court in Vermont, there's a committee, a standing committee, and it's bipartisan by nature. The chairs of the judiciary committees in both houses will be on it, the Bar Association, and a variety of people. And it's almost always by nature bipartisan and fairly centrist. They will vet candidates and send me a list, and I have to choose from that list. And if I want to send the whole list back, I can, but I may not do what the President of the United States is doing today, which is to pluck somebody, whether they're competent or qualified or not. I mean, the guy who I just read you about, who's up for a circuit court judge, he's clearly incompetent, if not insane, with some of the stuff I mean, imagine having somebody like that in the bench and then respecting the results of your court case. So the system that we have is you don't actually get to choose. You get to choose from a list in Vermont, and I don't get to put my crony on there or somebody who's been vetted by the Federalist Society. They're vetted by a bunch of people who've been around for a while, who've looked at the law from all different ways and actually believes in the rule of law, which is the fundamental problem we have here. What McConnell and Trump have done, and the Federalist Society, and the corruption that's going on, is an assault on the rule of law, and that is all that saves us from being the Soviet Union or Russia.
Congresswoman Shea-Porter, do you think that we should now require of anyone running for president some type of a litmus test list of names of potential nominees for the Supreme Court moving forward? Like, if I'm elected, these are the folks I'm going to be looking to be replacing any vacancies. Should we be having that conversation now more openly?
Well, let me add something
Sure.
to what the governor said first. The idea that we don't really have a code of ethics is amazing, for judges. So think about that. Ginny Thomas, I think her first name is Ginny, who was a justice's wife, is a member of the Tea Party. And she now, no matter what you think of the Tea Party, we all know it's a political party, right? And so she's out there working the country, raising money and doing things like that, right? For what cause? So I can remember a spouse saying years ago, a spouse of a justice, that she was not allowed to have an opinion about anything, and it really upset her, and I can understand why it did, right? Because they were just so strict that you just didn't even exist. There was nothing, because nobody wanted to even suggest, even send a whiff of anything to a justice, that there could be a problem there. So that's the first thing that we need to do. The second thing, and we don't talk about this, it really should be first every time we talk, is campaign finance reform.
Yep.
this is what this is about. They have their agenda, but they wouldn't have the money for their agenda if we had campaign finance reform. So think about our senator in Maine, okay, Susan Collins, who took that vote and voted for Justice Kavanaugh. Just a while ago, up in Maine, she was at a fundraiser. She called it a small fundraiser, 21 people, no big deal. Couldn't understand why she got the attention of the press and others. The reason she got the attention was because the head of the Federalist Society was there, and he is the one who has so much money and has been really funding all of this. If he and others on both sides, let me say I'm not just directing at Republicans here, Democrats, anybody running, if the money wasn't always there, then they would not be as effective. That take the money out and you'd be shocked at how much cleaner everything would be everywhere. Legislation, courts, everything that we do. So to me, that's incredibly important to bring up, those 2 points. As for the other, I'm really sorry that we've come to this point, because I do remember a time when, that you would see a judge come before the Supreme Court and the decision could be everybody was supporting the candidate, that it wasn't based on political party. But here we are now. So I think it's essential for those of us who do not agree with the Trump administration philosophy, who have trouble with the decisions coming out of the courts on the environment, coming out on women's right to choose, coming out on immigration, coming out on LGBTQ rights, et cetera, to be engaged and to be paying attention to who these candidates are and to be pushing back. And when we get this country back on track, and I hope it will be very soon that President Trump does get defeated, I would hope that we see I don't even want to say bipartisan, let's say nonpartisan effort to put us back on track so that Americans will have confidence in whomever is on the court. And it's not just the Supreme Court. And Donald Trump is working his way through the appeals court, he's in the district court. The impact is just, we're going to be living this for decades, absolute decades, because they are deliberately choosing, and they brag about it, choosing young men and women to run, primarily white men, I might add, but they are choosing by age as well as their political leanings, because they want to make sure they have a lock on this court for a long time. And that, in my mind, is just, corrupting the whole system.
Governor, do you think, as a former presidential candidate, you were used to being asked literally every possible conceivable question as you were running for president back then? Do you think we need to be grilling our candidates for president and the president more about who they would choose and what their tests would look like?
We really do. And it needs to be beyond the one shot, what are your litmus tests? Do you have any litmus tests? That's just a gotcha question. And
Sure.
It's not a serious question. We need to have somebody, I would love to have a panel discussion from one of the networks with some of the candidates about what are you going to do about this? Because this is a problem. You can't just go back to business as usual and say, okay, they had their turn and now we're going to have ours. Fundamental damage has been done to the courts. And it's not just by this administration. I mentioned Justice Stevens before. In Bush versus Gore, he wrote in Bush versus Gore that, as a member of the minority, 5-4, that this decision, the risk of this decision is that the court will be seen as partisan from henceforth, which is exactly what's happened. So this problem was not created since Donald Trump. This has been going on at least since a decision, and I would defer to Maggie because she's an attorney and I'm not, but this was not grounded in law. And when the last sentence in your decision is, and this case shall not be used as precedent for any future case, pretty much tells you what they were doing. So that, there was partisan before and the court was an issue before. That was a fundamentally corrupt decision. And I think, frankly, Al Gore, who's a great friend of mine, made a mistake in not taking that to where the Constitution said you're supposed to decide these matters, which is Congress. And we may well have lost anyway, because it's a very complicated system, but we might well have lost. But the court had no say in this. And it's gotten worse and worse and worse since. So there are going to be some fundamental reforms. It's not just enough to go back and, okay, now you appointed yours, now we'll appoint ours. We're going to have to do something fundamentally different. And I'm interested, that is That's the level of which I'd like to have the discussion, not who are your litmus tests for a judge. That doesn't mean anything.
That makes a lot of sense. Congresswoman, in the meantime, let's apply out where all these selections are and these people that are going to be on the bench making these decisions. What do you think will be the future fate of Roe v. Wade? What are your concerns? Where's that conversation headed?
Well, I'm very worried about it. Obviously, there's a lot of state action by Republicans who are working very hard to take away women's right to choose. And these cases, it's difficult for any groups that want women to have the right to choose to go to the Supreme Court now, because they're worried with the 5-4 split that we actually could lose that freedom. And so a lot of these are being played out on the state level. And I am very worried, and I can remember when we were talking about this a few years ago and talking about that it's not just going to be that. It's not just going to be the issue of abortion. It will be the issue of birth control. It'll be the issue of funding for it, et cetera, and that's what's been happening. So we're seeing people pulling us even further to the right and actually pulling us into a religious fight. And whatever your personal opinion is, and I'm sure we all have different opinions in this room on this issue, it has been ruled and it is a law, and the only way this can be overturned is through the Supreme Court, and that's why I am so deeply worried, because we can see what's happening. We've heard statements and we know the general direction. So for everybody who thinks that, you know, we should be out there, I urge you to get out there and write letters, because we can't just do it with the three of us. We can't just do it with Congress. We can't just hand this responsibility over to one group. Each one of us needs to be talking about this, writing letters, calling and making our opinions known and our concerns known. I'm very concerned.
Maggie, a couple follow-up questions. How relevant do you think the Supreme Court will be in the coming year in terms of its docket, and how much of a conversation do you think that will apply into the 2020 election cycle that we're now on that doorstep? What do you see?
Well, you know, Congresswoman Shea-Porter just mentioned the very real threat to Roe v. Wade, and coming over here this morning, I heard on NPR just another story about a heartbeat bill in South Carolina that's making its way up. So I think this is a very real possibility that the question will be presented to the court, and the question is whether the court will grant cert on that issue. And so I have no doubt that the court will touch the issue of abortion to begin with in the coming year. And it takes 4 votes to grant cert on a question, on a legal question. And so before the court really has full discretion on which cases that they hear. So I think, you know, it's a tough one on both sides, because on the one hand, I think there is a very real risk that the court 5-4 would rule to overrule Roe v. Wade. On the other hand, you know, you look around the country today, and in most states, in many states, it's very, very difficult for women to get access to clinics where they can actually get an abortion. So you look at the state of Missouri, there's only 1 clinic left open in the whole state. So the assault on Roe is happening on the ground, and I think it'll play out in the courts. And that's really just the beginning. I think, you know, across the whole range of really crucial issues for the 2020 election, the ACA right now is being litigated for the 3rd time, and probably not the last time, in the 5th Circuit. The government has decided not to defend the constitutionality of the statute, and that really could definitely find its way up to the Supreme Court this year. Beyond that, with respect to immigration, there are a whole range of issues that could come before the court. The DACA program, which was rescinded, that would have given a path to citizenship for Dreamers, the court has granted cert in the last week of this year's term. They granted cert on that. You've got the asylum ban. You've got the president's authority to build the wall on the southern border and reappropriate funds. So immigration is a huge set of issues. And then, you know, in my mind, among the most important ones are the questions about the health of our own democracy. So the Supreme Court ended its term at the last day with 2 decisions that really strike to the heart of our constitutional republic. The partisan gerrymandering case and the census case. And I think, you know, each of those issue sets could come back to the court again this year in another form. With respect to redistricting, first of all, there are all kinds of, there's constantly litigation on racial gerrymandering. And then with respect to partisan gerrymandering, the court decided in 2012 on 5-4 to uphold independent redistricting commissions as a constitutional way of carrying out the redistricting process. That decision, I think, is, you know, I'm hopeful that the court won't go in that direction, but there's a challenge in Michigan right now to the constitutionality of independent redistricting commissions. You know, foreign interference in elections, the whole range of issues are totally on the table.
Before we turn it over to some questions from the audience, and what I'll do is, I think what we'll do is just have you put up your hand. I'll just call on you. You can say your first name and throw your question out, because I'd love to be able to bring some questions in from all of you. But before we do that, a question for the three of you. Now that you've set that table, Maggie, I'm curious about how the three of you envision the role going forward in the right now of our Chief Justice. Maggie, I think you described him as a swing vote. What role does he play, and how could you elaborate on what we can expect from him as we navigate through these very difficult issues for the next 12 months or so?
Well, he is the swing vote on the court, and it's a remarkable thing when you look at kind of how far we've come. For the Chief Justice to be the swing vote is, I think, sort of says everything you need to know. You know, I think swing might be a generous way to describe it. But I do think, I will say, I do think that the Chief Justice is clearly, you know, an institutionalist, and I think he's aware that he's the most powerful Chief Justice in American history because he's the swing vote, and that has not happened as far as I know. But, you know, I really think that just that dynamic is another reason why we really need reform of the court, because no one person should hold so much power.
That's a good point. Congresswoman?
So I think we do need to be a little partisan here, because everything that we're talking about happening on the state level and indeed on the federal level is coming through the Republican Party as we know it today. Now, I always like to tell people I grew up in a conservative Republican family, so I have a love and appreciation for that party as we knew it then. But it's very different now. And there are members of Congress who say things, including, you know, somebody in our state that I ran against. No abortion, no exceptions, not even for the life of the mother. So we should know that there are candidates and there are members of Congress out there who hold pretty extreme positions, something that my very conservative Catholic mother would not agree with. She would not ever say that a woman should die because there has to be no exceptions to the rule here. So it does mean that we have to not only look at the Supreme Court and look at the president, but we have to look at people who are running for Congress and ask them, what is your position? State it clearly on immigration, on the right to marry, on a woman's right to choose, on environmental, you know, whatever it is that's driving you, and hopefully all of those issues are, that we do need to engage in this political process, because there is a big difference. And when we talk about what's happening in the state, we have to remember that actually the state houses across since 2010 have been falling to the Republicans. And so that's driving it. And not just Republicans, and we see, and I thank those Republicans who are speaking out against this, and there are many, but we see a very hardcore right-wing Tea Party kind of Republican legislator, and they are in the state houses forcing these issues like, you know, the heartbeat issue, et cetera.
Governor, your thoughts about Justice Roberts?
You know, I think he's very bright. He's very political. He is, I think, definitely, the court is very far out of step with where the American people are, where most American public is. Very far out of step. They certainly, you know, they are basically the people who donate to the Federalist Society are huge businesses and corporations. I dare say the justices know who they are. We don't, because it's not public. So it's a business court. The Chamber of Commerce has won 70% of their cases under Roberts. And that's not in this age of inequality, which is probably the biggest issue underlying a lot of on both sides. I mean, I think Trump wouldn't have been elected had it not been for the frustration of an awful lot of people who were, I mean, yes, there was racism and all that, but there was certainly hardcore people who were just really upset that they weren't getting ahead and that people with $1 billion were getting all the influence they wanted. Well, the Federalist Society is that problem. And so Roberts is riding a bit of a tiger. He is by nature very conservative, very conservative. Some of the stuff he's written is certainly not as crude as the stuff I read earlier, but it's somewhat symptomatic. I mean, the way to stop talking about race is to stop talking about race. That's what he said when he upended the Voting Rights Act. Since the Voting Rights Act is gone, Brian Kemp is now governor of Georgia, having disenfranchised over 350,000 predominantly African-American voters. Scott Walker, Wisconsin, went to Donald Trump because hundreds and thousands of black people were disenfranchised in Milwaukee. That's the penalty of losing the Voting Rights Act. So I don't know what to expect from Roberts. Roberts saved the ACA. He knows that if the Affordable Care Act goes down before the election, all those people who are losing their exemption for pre-existing conditions are going to be done with. That's what drove us into office in 2018. More than anything else was the insecurity about health care and what Trump was doing. If the court overturns the Affordable Care Act, the pre-existing condition protection goes out the window. So I think they'll find a way not to decide that for as long as possible, and if they do, they'll do some mealy-mouthed thing, because he is very, very political. And you know, the truth is, do you really want a politician as the head of the Supreme Court? The only politician that really did a great job, in my view, in my lifetime as the head of the Supreme Court was Earl Warren. And Eisenhower, who was a moderate Republican, said it was the worst appointment he ever made. It was the best appointment he ever made, and it was, I think, the greatest Chief Justice in my lifetime for the courage that he showed in doing what was right. And what we need more than anything else is a court that will do what was right, not what's expedient.
Thank you, Governor. You know, I started this entire conversation as we're sitting here. I'm a Supreme Court voter, the big sign right behind us, about the U.S. Supreme Court, and yet we started the conversation about an appellate court nominee, and I would be remiss if I didn't at least throw to Maggie for a quick reaction the fact that right here in New Hampshire, we had a very emotional and historic outcome in a state Supreme Court nomination with our own Attorney General being rejected by the Executive Council over some partisan conversations about his appointment to the state Supreme Court. So I guess, Maggie, maybe it's the telegraphed question and the worst one I could come up with, but is there really any question at this point that any conversation we're having about court appointments and the process, it's not just about the U.S. Supreme Court anymore, it's about all of these appointments up and down the line across the board at state and federal level. Is it really now a conversation we have to have about our judicial system and who's running it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's no question that the ripple effects are very real. And, I'm not sure that Senator McConnell really understood that when he, tweeted within minutes of Justice Scalia's passing that he would not confirm President Obama's nominee, he had any sense that this would not only touch the federal courts, but also the state courts. And, I think, Congresswoman Shea-Porter said we've crossed the Rubicon. There's no turning back. In my lifetime, the transition has occurred. I was born on Election Day in 1986, and a few weeks before that, Justice Scalia was confirmed unanimously. A few months later, Justice Kennedy was confirmed unanimously. 4 years or a few years later, Justice Ginsburg was confirmed nearly unanimously. But those days are so far gone. And I think that it's, to me, a first step is got to be a reform that brings regularity to the process. Because part of the problem is there's a gaming, on multiple levels of gaming in the nomination process. And so one proposal that I think is very interesting is an 18-year, I'm not going to say term limit because that's a trap, an 18-year active term of service on the Supreme Court. Which would basically allow for, once the system got up and running, a president to nominate a justice every 2 years. And so that, I think, would bring a great deal of regularity to the process, and that, to me, is a really necessary first step.
Thank you for that.
Can I just add one
Yeah,
thing quickly?
go ahead.
Just so you know, that is constitutional. It's not constitutional to have term limits. The Constitution says when you get appointed to the federal bench, it's a lifetime appointment, but it doesn't say when you get appointed to the Supreme Court. So what Maggie's talking about is actually not kicking people off the judiciary after 18 years. She's talking about putting them on a different federal court. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so from the beginning of the court, you know, in 1790, there weren't really a robust set of federal circuit courts. They were just beginning to be created. And so the justices of the Supreme Court would do something called riding circuit, which meant that they got into their carriages and they went out across the country and they heard cases around the country. And it's I think, you know, this is a great thing for everybody, because it gets actually communities more engaged with the work of the court. You know, Chief Justice John Marshall, broke his collarbone riding circuit, and I think this is a very worthy injury, one that hopefully will not occur in the future. But you know, I think the idea of getting out there is. Pardon me?
Possibly so. Well, Maggie, thank you. All right, let's jump in with the few minutes we have left with questions. And gentlemen, right here, right in front, we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm a lawyer. I think if you ask for show of hands,
We've got a microphone right there for
more
you.
lawyers in this room than the national average. Hi, my name is Jim. I'm a lawyer. I think there are a lot of lawyers in this room, and the rule of law really is what we're talking about. And I don't want to broaden it to the issue of Congress doing its job and impeaching the guy who's really the poster boy for messing this up, which is Trump. But I do want to say that we have a teacher of the law, which I deeply respect, and we've got to educate Americans. And we have a person in the White House who wants to be a tyrant, and there's this little book I've been buying for people and gifting. It's $5 delivered from Amazon, called On Tyranny, and I would encourage everybody who's an educator to read that book, because we're reliving the destruction of the checks and balances, basically. That's what we're talking about. On Tyranny.
Tim Snyder.
Yeah. So it's not a question, I suppose, but you got to start somewhere. And there's this other book by Michael Lewis called The Fifth Risk, which tells us what's going on. And also the nobility of the federal departments and all the good things they're doing. And hopefully Trump won't be able to get rid of all of them by the time he's out of office. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that, Jim. Let's get a young person perspective, then we'll move back to this table over here. The gentleman in the glasses. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Sean. I've just had a question. A few of you have mentioned campaign finance reform. So I was wondering what steps you think would be necessary to implement it, such as maybe overturning Citizens United.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Congresswoman McGovern?
Let me give you a two-second story about this. So I do a lot of international work for a democracy-building organization, and I'm in Ukraine when Yanukovych was president, which is how I knew about Paul Manafort, way long before anybody else did. So I'm talking to Yanukovych's staff, chief of staff, and who was actually, they had a quota. You can have one honest person in this regime, right? She was great. She was a political science professor, economics professor from the university. And we're talking about the Russians and all this other stuff. And I'm saying, you know, if you're going to try Tymoshenko, who was the person he actually defeated in a fair election, you can't try her here, because in an emerging democracy, if you try your opponent, nobody's going to believe you. You send her to the European courts, because she was alleged to have been involved in corruption as well. And they didn't pay any attention to that. And then I started talking about oligarchs and political parties. And I said, you know, you really can't have oligarchs running your political parties. And I said, oh, Madam Chief of Staff, I had to stop at the midpoint here, because our court has just legalized oligarchs running political parties, one of whom just died, David Koch. So the best form of campaign finance reform is public financing of campaigns. And interestingly enough, although people will beat up on it and saying, you know, this is politicians, they don't need money. Actually, in Arizona, they had a great system. And Arizona is moving slightly blue, but it was pretty darn red, Both Democrats and Republicans agree on two things. I mean, rank and file, we're not talking politicians. They hate gerrymandering because they don't think politicians should write their own job description. And they hate the way the campaigns are financed because they really hate money trumping their vote. They passed a campaign finance reform bill, which is public financing of campaigns. And I won't go into all the details. The Chamber of Commerce and the labor unions got together to try to overturn it together, right? Because they're very influential. They lost in a referendum in Arizona. And the only reason they don't have public financing and by the way, Arizona elected both a Democratic governor and a Republican governor under public financing. And the only reason they don't have it today is Citizens United killed that too. So that's what we have to do. We have to overturn Citizens United, and then I think we should institute public financing of campaigns. There'll be a huge hullabaloo about it because the right wing, which tends to be authoritarian, will say, oh, we can't have it. It's just filling money in the pockets of politicians. I think now, we're in the middle of the most corrupt administration, and that's saying something because Warren Harding was pretty bad. You know, I think people are sick of this. And you want to know why Trump's numbers are going down, which they are today, down to 36, is because of the corruption issue.
Thank you for your question. Right here in the front.
That's you.
Hi, thank you for this very interesting discussion. My name's Louise, and one of my biggest concerns about the Trump administration is the assault on our essential democratic institutions, whether that be, you know, the media or the courts. And I am very concerned when we talk about rule of law that's based in this idea of checks and balances. And with the Trump administration refusing, for example, claiming executive privilege and refusing to turn over essential documents to Congress that are necessary for its investigative functions, I have great concern that this court, as it stands, is not going to enforce that essential role of Congress, and that we're going to lose something so fundamental to our democracy, which is this checks and balances. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Good question.
You know, it goes beyond the policy decisions of the courts and really to how our system is constitutionally structured.
Maggie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, I think that, you know, as I said, the court is going to hear major cases, not just this year, but in the decades ahead. But I think especially right now, you know, in the lead up to a census, the court's heard sort of, I think, Act 1 of what could be a multi-part, and just to take, for example, the census, which is kind of where everything stems from in one view of the system, because you count the number of people in the country, that informs the redistricting process, and, you know, everything else falls into place from there. I think that I don't have a lot of encouraging things to say on this front. My hope is that some sense of norms and reasonableness will prevail, and I think we saw in this most recent census case maybe the most hopeful showing of sort of what can happen when the court decides a question of law. And so actually I love this case because it's an administrative law case. It's a case it's a constitutional law case, but the real question was whether or not the Department of Commerce complied with the Administrative Procedure Act's requirement that it not make an arbitrary and capricious decision when it came to adding the citizenship question to the census. And I mean, it's a very obvious decision in my view. You know, lying is arbitrary and capricious. So, okay. But, you know, but it wasn't, unfortunately, a foregone conclusion. So, you know, I think that we can be hopeful that there's some modicum of, you know, respect for the rule of law, but this is a really worrisome time, and it's a worrisome issue set. You know, from redistricting, which could come back to the court again, to the census, to all the state voting rights statutes that'll come before the court. You know, the court upheld an Ohio statute that purged a lot of voters from the rolls in Ohio a year and a half ago, and you know, there are plenty of laws like it around the country that could be upheld.
Thank you for that. Right here, right in the middle.
My name's Richard. I wonder how are we going to affect all these reforms without changing politics, without electing different senators? I've thought about, but don't bother to, write to my senators here in New Hampshire, because I know they think like I do, and they're voting the way I would have them vote. The trouble is, a senator in Kentucky, who's elected by people from Kentucky, and how are we going to get to any of this reform without changing the Senate?
Good question. Good question. Thank you. Congresswoman?
So I have a plan.
I hope so.
I was thinking about how we keep getting stuck with Mitch McConnell, right? And I know they work very hard to defeat him, but it doesn't work. And then I said, well, wait a minute. Why aren't we talking to all of the senators in swing districts and asking them if they intend to vote for Mitch McConnell? Because that would be the test for voters, to ask their senators, or those who are running to be their senators, what their position is. Because Mitch McConnell is elected there. So if they could say, no, I don't agree with Mitch McConnell doing, we could give the litany of things that Mitch McConnell has done, which I think is against our best interest. I'm talking about the people of this country. Then I think we could actually change that. So maybe Mitch McConnell would still be there, but maybe he wouldn't be the leader anymore if we could get all these candidates on record. But what happens here, you're absolutely right. They have to have a change in the opinions and the change actually in the party right now, unless we hear Republicans who are running state that they actually believe the traditional Republican positions instead of the far right-wing positions. So we are a little stuck, but I wanted to go back to the campaign finance reform because we're not totally trapped here. When I was running from the very beginning, I didn't take any corporate PAC, I didn't take any business money, I didn't take any DC lobbyist money at all. And I got yelled at a lot by my party, and a lot of Republicans weren't even, they just thought it was humorous that we were doing that. Since then, there have been a number of campaigns that have actually run without that kind of money. And citizens have stepped up to support that kind of campaign. I won, and many others are winning, saying they're not going to take that money because, not that they would necessarily be personally influenced, but they didn't want to have the appearance of being influenced by that. And I've seen plenty of people take money and vote against the group that gave them money, but that's not the point. So what we could do, you asked, is first of all, we could expose the dark money so that nobody gets to just funnel money without saying who they are and to identify themselves. They should identify themselves on television. They have all kinds of names, committees that love kittens and puppies, right? And really what they're doing is undermining our democracy. So they should have to say who they are, no more dark money. I think it's fair to put limits on it. I know in 2010 and we have to overturn Citizens United. In 2010, I was outspent 10-1. After that decision, it was like an avalanche of dirty money. I said, just float out of the sewer. So we need to stop that. And to do that, all of us need to be active. We need to write not just to our own senators, not to our own representatives, but to others as well. And to put letters there. You'd be surprised. You can get letters in lots of different papers. You can make phone calls. You can show up. You can ask your friends who live in other states to show up. I'm talking about grassroots activism because we're not going to change it without people rising up to force change.
This morning has been a little bit like the iceberg, right? We're just scratching the surface of a conversation that really needs a great deal more depth and detail. And I'm looking at the clock, and unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank all of you for a vigorous conversation, and Congresswoman Shea-Porter and Maggie Goodlander and Governor Dean. Very, very warm thank you. Deep gratitude for your thoughts and opinions on this very important conversation. And I hope, if nothing else, what we all leave with is a sense of confirmed direction in making sure that this is a conversation that is really far more robust outside of this room and in our American political system at all levels, because it really does need to be held. Questions need to be asked, and questions need to be answered. But I want to thank all of you, and thanks very much to our panel. A round of applause for our experts this morning. Thank you. Thanks very much.